April 14th, 2026. 2:31 local time. The Strait of Hormuz. 21 nautical miles wide at its narrowest point. One of the most heavily monitored contested waterways on Earth. The USS Truxtun has turned back 12 ships in 68 hours. The 13th is accelerating. I'm your host at Navy Powerline, where we break down critical naval operations and what they mean for global power. Today, we're tracking the most intensive naval interdiction window since the tanker wars of the 1980s. 72 hours in which a single Arleigh Burke-class destroyer became the primary instrument of American sea power in the Persian Gulf. We're going to go through all 13 intercepts, one by one, until we reach the one that broke the pattern, because 12 of those encounters ended the same way. Radio challenge, warning illumination, course diversion, textbook. The 13th did not, and what the VBSS boarding team found aboard that final vessel would change how Fifth Fleet analysts understood Iranian Shadow Fleet command and control architecture for the rest of Operation Seahorse, and expose a method of maritime intelligence gathering that had been running for 72 hours before anyone recognized it for what it was. Let's go back to the beginning. To understand what the USS Truxtun was doing in the Strait in April 2026, you need to understand what led up to it. Beginning in late February 2026, following the collapse of the fifth round of Vienna-format nuclear talks, the United States Fifth Fleet initiated Operation Seahorse, a graduated maritime pressure campaign targeting Iranian weapons proliferation routes through the Strait of Hormuz and the northern Arabian Sea. The legal basis came from the Proliferation Security Initiative, a framework 62 nations had signed, authorizing interdiction of vessels reasonably suspected of transporting weapons of mass destruction precursors, dual-use components, or sanctioned cargo. Under Seahorse's rules of engagement, U.S. Navy vessels were authorized to challenge, warn, and, if necessary, board any vessel transiting the strait that declined to respond to radio challenges and showed indicators consistent with illicit cargo. Those indicators had been refined through 3 months of signals intelligence, human intelligence from Bahraini and Emirati port authorities, and commercial satellite imagery of loading operations at Bandar Abbas. The Truxtun, hull designation DDG-103, was an Arleigh Burke Flight II-A destroyer. Displacement, 9,200 tons full load. Length, 509 feet. Armed with a 96-cell Mark 41 vertical launch system capable of hosting SM-2 Block 3B missiles for air defense, LRASM anti-ship missiles, and Tomahawk land attack missiles for deep strike. For close-in work, a Mark 38 25mm chain gun on the bridge wing and 2 twin-mounted .50 caliber M2HB machine guns. The VBSS team, Visit, Board, Search and Seizure, carried EM-4 carbines and non-lethal crowd control. Their job was not combat. Their job was law enforcement at sea, under the shadow of the guns behind them. The Truxtun's commanding officer was Captain Darien Marsh, a surface warfare officer with 2 prior Gulf deployments and 18 months at the Navy's Strategic Studies Group in Newport. His crew of 328 had conducted 6 live interdiction exercises in the 60 days prior to assignment. They knew the procedures. They had run the scenarios. What they were not prepared for was the pace. Standard planning assumptions had projected 2 to 4 intercepts per 72-hour patrol cycle. The actual number, 13, exceeded worst-case estimates by a factor of 3. According to after-action assessments reviewed by Fifth Fleet analysts, Iranian Shadow Fleet operators had deliberately compressed their transit schedules in the 48 hours before the Truxtun arrived on station, concentrating vessel movements to stress test the practical capacity of a single destroyer interdiction line. How a planning cell in Bandar Abbas knew the Truxtun's deployment timeline with that precision was itself a question. It was not answered until day 3. The first intercept came at 14:22 on April 11th. The target, a general cargo vessel registered in Tuvalu, transiting westbound through the main shipping lane. The ship's AIS transponder was active, technically compliant, but Truxtun's intelligence officer, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Kessler, flagged a discrepancy. The vessel's declared cargo was industrial ceramics. Its declared port of origin was Sharjah, UAE. But it had been observed by a P-8 Poseidon Maritime Patrol aircraft offloading containers at Bandar Abbas 3 days earlier. The cargo had changed. The paperwork had not. Bridge-to-bridge radio challenge at 1422. The vessel's master responded promptly, agreed to heave to. 14 minutes later, a VBSS team had boots on the deck. The manifest listed 1,100 metric tons of industrial alumina. In most contexts, perfectly legal. In the context of a vessel that had spent 14 hours at Bandar Abbas's Shahid Raja'i terminal 2 weeks prior, it was worth a second look. The alumina checked out. The vessel was released in 41 minutes. First intercept complete. Intercepts 2 through 4 unfolded across the following 19 hours, each following the same operational rhythm. Vessels with port-of-call anomalies, paperwork inconsistencies, or AIS gaps that fell within Fifth Fleet's interdiction criteria. 2 were boarded and released. 1, a Panamanian-flagged tanker, provided documentation sufficient to clear challenge at the bridge-to-bridge level without a boarding. 3 encounters, 3 clean resolutions, 4 total. Intercept 5 was different. 417, April the 12th. A general cargo vessel. No AIS signal. Running dark. The Truxtun's AN/SPS-67 surface search radar acquired the contact at 11 nautical miles, bearing 043. Speed, 8 knots. Draft consistent with a loaded vessel in the 6,000 to 8,000 deadweight ton range. No transponder, no radio traffic, no lights. A vessel of that size, at that draft, with no radio presence, at 4 in the morning, does not go dark by accident. Someone made a choice. Captain Marsh brought the Truxtun to battle stations. Challenge on Channel 16. Silence. Challenge repeated in Farsi. Silence. The Mark 38 was brought to ready. The signal lamp began flashing the international challenge pattern across the dark water. The vessel reduced speed to 4 knots. Not compliance, not acceleration. A pause. I spent considerable time going through the bridge log from this intercept, and one detail kept nagging me. That pause was exactly 14 seconds, long enough to appear as hesitation, short enough that it could later be characterized as the master assessing the situation. Naval analysts reviewing the encounter after the fact assessed it as deliberate. Standard Iranian maritime friction doctrine, designed to occupy American decision-making bandwidth without technically triggering a kinetic response. 14 seconds of calculated ambiguity at 4 in the morning, 90 miles from the nearest friendly port. The VBSS team boarded at 5:03. The vessel was the Sahand Star, an Iranian-owned cargo ship operating under a Comoros flag. The master spoke functional English. The declared cargo, industrial-grade ball bearings, 700 metric tons, declared destination Muscat. The master had an explanation for the AIS silence. A unit malfunctioned 2 days prior, he said, and he hadn't been able to reach his owner for replacement authorization. The VBSS team photographed everything, took hull samples from the ballast tank vents, pulled the engine room logs, released the vessel at 6:51. The ball bearings were legitimate. What wasn't legitimate, identified 22 hours later when Defense Intelligence Agency analysts cross-referenced the hull samples against Iranian port records, was the Sahand Star's actual previous port of call. Not Bandar Abbas, Keshem Island, specifically the Keshem Free Zone Industrial Complex, where at least 2 known IRGC front companies maintained warehousing facilities. Captain Marsh had been right to release the Sahand Star. The rules of engagement required actionable evidence of prohibited cargo. Ball bearings didn't qualify. The intelligence about Keshem arrived 22 hours after the boarding. You cannot hold a vessel on suspicion of what you might find tomorrow. Here's the take that's going to draw pushback from people who weren't there. Captain Marsh made the correct legal and tactical decision releasing the Sahand Star, and the analysts who second-guessed that call from their desks in Bahrain were applying hindsight to a decision that had to be made in real time with the information available at 6 a.m. on April 12th. The ROE had a ceiling. The intelligence didn't arrive in time to change it. That's not a failure of judgment. That's a failure of the intelligence to operations pipeline. And it's a systemic problem, not Marsh's. That decision had a consequence. We'll get to it. Intercepts 6 through 10 executed across the afternoon and evening of April 12th and the early hours of April 13th with the mechanical precision of a well-rehearsed drill. 2 vessels boarded, 8 VBSS operators cycling in and out of the ship's 2 MH-60R Seahawk helicopters on successive sorties. 3 vessels diverted at radio challenge without boarding. 2 more turned after warning illumination from the Mark 38. Textbook. Every single one. But the crew was exhausted. That is not a minor detail. After 61 hours of continuous operations at 4 times the planned tempo, watch sections had been compressed. Sleep cycles were disrupted across all divisions. The bridge team handling Intercept 11, a Marshall Islands-flagged chemical tanker at 2314 on April 13th, consisted of officers on their second consecutive 18-hour watch. The challenge and divert completed normally. The vessel was cleared at 23:51. But Lieutenant Commander Kessler, reviewing the tanker's signal profile afterward, flagged something the exhausted bridge team had not caught during the live engagement. The tanker had briefly illuminated a secondary radar, not its navigation radar, but a signal consistent with a maritime communications buoy, for approximately 40 seconds during the radio challenge phase. A 40-second burst transmission. Direction: north-northeast, toward the Iranian coast. The tanker was already 2 miles clear of the interdiction line when Kessler brought her findings to Marsh. What's most surprising about this case isn't that the tanker transmitted, it's what that transmission revealed. Fifth Fleet SIGINT analysts would later assess the 40-second burst as a command and control relay. The tanker was not just a cargo vessel. It was an active node in an IRGC maritime communications network, transmitting real-time operational data on Truxtun's interdiction procedures back to a shore-based control center at Bandar Abbas. Every vessel that had been challenged, boarded, or diverted in the previous 68 hours had updated that picture. By the time the 13th vessel approached the line, whoever was running Iranian Shadow Fleet operations that night had a detailed, current picture of Truxtun's challenge protocols, boarding timelines, VBSS deployment procedures, and, critically, crew operational tempo. 12 ships had been used to build an intelligence picture. The 13th was the weapon. What this operational design reveals is how the IRGC thinks about maritime conflict. This was not a smuggling run that happened to get caught. It was a structured intelligence operation with a kinetic endpoint. 12 vessels as sensors, 1 designated actor. The patience required for that architecture, the resource commitment needed to manage a 12-ship reconnaissance screen across 72 hours, reflects institutional sophistication that Western threat assessments consistently underrate. 2:17, April 14th. Truxtun's surface search radar painted a new contact bearing 037, range 19 nautical miles. Speed, 11 knots, AIS active. Vessel identification transmitted, Sahand Star, general cargo, Iranian flag, declared destination Fujairah, UAE. Declared cargo, industrial machinery components. Nothing in the initial contact report was alarming. The Sahand Star's AIS had been active continuously for the previous 18 hours. Its course was consistent with a standard westbound commercial transit. Speed and draft looked normal for a loaded vessel in its class. Lieutenant Commander Kessler ran the vessel name through the 5th Fleet Intelligence Database at 2:23. The result came back in 41 seconds. The Sahand Star had been observed at Bandar Abbas's Container Terminal 2 on April 9th. Loading operations. Commercial satellite imagery processed by a National Geospatial Intelligence Agency contractor showed the vessel taking cargo from a warehouse registered to Kayla Electric. A company the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control had sanctioned in 2024 for procuring components for Iran's uranium enrichment program. The specific items loaded at Terminal 2 had not been identified through imagery alone, but the association was sufficient to trigger Seahorse interdiction criteria. Captain Marsh was on the bridge by 02:31. The radio challenge went out on Channel 16 at 02:34. Standard format. Vessel identification, position confirmation, declared intent to conduct a compliance boarding. The Sahand Star's master acknowledged, said he understood, said he was complying. Then he altered course to starboard and increased speed. The course change was recorded in Truxtun's bridge log at 2:36:17. Speed increase confirmed by Doppler radar at 2:36:44. The new course, 287 degrees. Not the diversion bearing Truxtun had specified, but a direct heading for the Truxtun's port quarter. The vector was unambiguous to every officer on the bridge. The Sahand Star was going to ram them. Put yourself in Captain Marsh's position at 2:37 on April 14th. You have a 6,000-ton cargo vessel accelerating toward your ship. Your VBSS team is staged on the helicopter deck. Your crew has been running continuous operations for 68 hours. The ship is closed up at general quarters. The geometry is simple, and it's getting worse by the second. You have 3 minutes, maybe less, before the window for a non-kinetic response closes permanently. Warning shots. The .50 caliber mounts opened at 2:38:03. 4 round bursts aimed to impact the water 100 meters ahead of the approaching vessel. Tracers visible across the dark water. Clear, visible, internationally recognized warning fire. You cannot miss it. You cannot misinterpret it. The Sahand Star did not slow. 12 knots, 13, still accelerating, 2 hours 38 minutes, 41 seconds. Captain Marsh authorized disabling fire. The Mark 38 25mm chain gun elevated. Targeting solution, the Sahand Star's stern quarter, where the vessel's rudder hydraulic system runs from the engine room aft to the rudder post assembly. A 60-round burst over 4 seconds. 25mm high-explosive incendiary rounds at a cyclic rate of 180 rounds per minute, impacting the target zone at approximately 800 meters range. The Sahand Star's helm lost response at 2:38:53, 12 seconds after the burst. The vessel coasted forward on momentum for another 40 seconds before going dead in the water, 400 meters off Truxtun's port side. 5th Fleet Damage Control Specialists, reviewing the geometry afterward, calculated that the Sahand Star at 13 knots on its final course would have impacted Truxtun's port quarter in approximately 90 seconds from the moment disabling fire was authorized. 90 seconds. At 13 knots, the collision energy would have been sufficient to penetrate the Truxtun's hull plating and potentially flood the aft engineering spaces. 90 seconds separated a successful deterrence operation from a catastrophic loss of a United States warship and its crew. The VBSS team launched at 02:47. 2 MH-60Rs, 12 operators, full personal protective equipment. The Sahand Star had a crew of 19. The first obstacle came immediately. The vessel's primary cargo hold had been sealed with supplementary weld brackets, non-standard, applied at Bandar Abbas, visible in the access hatch framing. The team's bolt cutters and pry bars couldn't break the welds. A cutting torch had to be retrieved from the Truxtun and flown over by the second MH-60R. 40 minutes. 40 minutes of 12 VBSS operators standing on an unsecured vessel. 3 miles from Iranian territorial waters in the dark, with no confirmation that all 19 crew members had been accounted for. During that 40-minute wait, 2 crew members were found locked in the engine room, locked in from the outside. The VBSS team leader's after-action assessment was direct. They had refused to participate in the operation, and the IRGC-aligned officers aboard had secured them below to prevent interference. The Sahand Star had not just been a cargo vessel. It had been a divided crew, and not everyone on it had chosen to be part of what happened that morning. The master, identified as Captain Farshad Mohammadi, 61 years old, a 30-year merchant marine veteran, was found on the bridge, unhurt, in possession of a satellite phone. On the screen, a text message received at 2:31, 14 minutes before Marsh had initiated his radio challenge. The message was in Farsi, translated, "Execute, do not stop, do not turn." The message had been sent from a number linked to an IRGC Quds Force logistics officer operating from a facility in Qom, the same facility that had provided operational clearance, documented in the signals intelligence cross-reference, to the Kaveh Star before its transit 3 days earlier. There it was, the connection that tied the first intercept to the last. The Kaveh Star hadn't merely been running ball bearings to Muscat. It had been running a message back to the Qom facility. The interdiction line was operational. The boarding procedures were thorough. The ROE had limits, and those limits had been tested. A vessel had been released. The ceiling had been located. And the IRGC had decided to find out what was above it. Here's what nobody expected about what came next. Captain Mohammadi's possession of that text message, sent 14 minutes before Truxtun even initiated contact, was not a vulnerability. It was the key to the entire legal architecture of what followed. 5th Fleet JAG officers, reviewing the phone records within hours, characterized the message as constituting command-directed hostile intent. Clear documentary evidence that the Sahand Star's actions were not those of a confused master who panicked. They were the actions of a man operating under explicit military orders to use his vessel as a weapon. That distinction mattered. Under international maritime law and the law of armed conflict, a civilian vessel acting under direct military orders to conduct a kinetic attack on a naval vessel loses its protected status. The Sahand Star was not, at the moment it altered course and accelerated, a civilian vessel. It was a military instrument directed by a state actor against a warship of another state. The disabling fire was not just tactically justified. It was the legally cleanest outcome Marsh could have achieved. The Sahand Star was taken in tow by a UAE Coast Guard vessel at 7:15. Its cargo was transferred to a 5th Fleet Intelligence Exploitation Team at Jebel Ali Port that afternoon. What was in the hold confirmed what the Kela electric connection had suggested. 8,000 precision-machined components, carbon fiber composite cylinder blanks and precision-bearing assemblies. For IR, 8 centrifuge construction. Dual-use items with declared commercial applications, but in the specific tolerances and quantities recovered, consistent only with enrichment-scale centrifuge programs. Routed from a Chinese manufacturing intermediary in Guangzhou through Bandar Abbas under an Iranian general cargo manifest. They were going to a facility that didn't officially exist. Captain Mohammadi was transferred to the USS Bataan, 5th Fleet's forward legal processing platform, where he was formally detained under the legal framework of the Maritime Drug Law Enforcement Act's proliferation analog provisions. His precise status, prisoner of war, criminal defendant, or unlawful combatant, became the subject of a 3-week interagency dispute involving the Justice Department, the State Department, CENTCOM Legal, and the National Security Council. That dispute was not resolved before this episode was recorded. It may not be resolved soon. The diplomatic fallout arrived within 6 hours. Iran's foreign ministry issued a statement condemning what it called an act of piracy and unlawful aggression against an Iranian civilian vessel in international waters. Tehran demanded immediate release of the Sahand Star, its crew, and its cargo. Iran's UN representative requested an Emergency Security Council session. China expressed deep concern and called for restraint. Russia co-signed the Security Council request. Neither mentioned the centrifuge components. Within the United States, 3 members of the Senate Armed Services Committee requested a classified briefing on Truxtun's rules of engagement. The committee's ranking member issued a public statement noting that the authorization of disabling fire against a merchant vessel in international waters represents a significant escalation in the application of force. One detail that stuck with me when reviewing the congressional reaction: the same 3 senators demanding a briefing on Truxtun's ROE had voted, in prior sessions, against strengthening the Proliferation Security Initiative's legal framework, the exact framework that gave Marsh the authority to act. The vessel they were now concerned about was carrying nuclear centrifuge components, operating under direct IRGC military command, on a course to physically ram an American warship. The political conversation and the operational reality were not in the same room. The most significant product of the Sahand Star intercept was not the centrifuge components. It was the intelligence. Analysis of Captain Mohammadi's communications devices, cross-referenced with the SIGINT from the chemical tanker's relay burst in Intercept 11, and the movement pattern data from all 12 preceding intercepts gave 5th Fleet analysts their first comprehensive picture of IRGC Shadow Fleet command and control architecture. 3 tiers, shore-based control centers, Bandar Abbas and Qom, confirmed a 3rd suspected at Chabahar, handled operational tasking. An intermediate relay layer, consisting of commercial vessels modified with secondary burst transmission equipment, passed operational status updates on a rolling schedule. Forward vessels received tasking through the relay layer, giving shore controllers real-time situational awareness while maintaining plausible deniability for individual shipmasters. The execute message to Mohammadi had traveled from Qom to a relay vessel to the Sahand Star in under 90 seconds. The relay vessel had been Intercept 11. The chemical tanker cleared at 23:51 the night before. The tanker Marsh had let go. The architecture explained something that had puzzled analysts from the operation's first day: how a shore-based planning cell had known the Truxtun's precise deployment timeline before it arrived on station. The relay layer had been operating before Seahorse began. It had been tracking U.S. Navy patrol patterns in the Strait for weeks. The deployment schedule had leaked somewhere in the administrative chain, not through espionage but through the simple predictability of published shipping advisories and patrol zone notifications that the Navy issues to commercial traffic as a matter of navigation safety. The IRGC didn't need spies. They needed patience and a calendar. What happened in the weeks after the Sahand Star intercept was predictable, and in some ways worse than the intercept itself. The IRGC Shadow Fleet network adapted. Relay vessels began randomizing their transmission intervals, complicating SIGINT pattern analysis. Shore control centers shifted from satellite phone text messaging to encrypted burst communications on frequencies previously associated with commercial fishing operations. The direct execute model that had been used to direct Mohammadi was abandoned. Too traceable, too attributable. The Truxtun's operation had worked, and in working, it had forced the IRGC to evolve toward communication security that was harder to penetrate. A tactical win, a strategic complication. Will the IRGC attempt another direct vessel-as-weapon approach in the Strait before the end of 2026? Comment yes or no, because the analysts disagree and your read matters. The centrifuge components never reached their intended facility. An IAEA technical assessment from May 2026 reviewed against Iran's declared enrichment programs, indicated a 4 to 6 month delay in the IR-8 centrifuge expansion at a facility associated with the Fordo enrichment complex. That delay had measurable consequences for Iran's nuclear timeline. Whether those consequences are sufficient is a question this operation cannot answer. The Truxtun returned to Bahrain on April 16th. Captain Marsh addressed his crew on the flight deck. According to 3 crew members interviewed afterward, he did not discuss the Sahand Star specifically. He said the Navy exists for exactly these moments. When the rules say one thing, the situation says another, and someone has to decide. 90 seconds from a collision that could have killed hundreds of American sailors, with 14 of his people staged on a helicopter deck waiting for orders, Marsh made a decision. The investigation into the Truxtun's use of force continues in Washington. Captain Mohammadi's legal status remains unresolved. 2 of the 12 diverted vessels have already returned to Bandar Abbas and resumed their transit cycle. The Kaveh Star, Intercept 5, the ship that started the chain, was observed by NGA satellite imagery at Keshem Island on April the 22nd. Reloading. Subscribe to Navy Powerline if you want to follow how Operation Seahorse develops, because the Sahand Star was not the last chapter, and the network it exposed is still operating. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 nautical miles wide. It carries 20% of the world's seaborne oil. As of April 2026, it is also the active front line of a conflict with no formal declaration, no public rules, and no clear endpoint. Conducted in the space between maritime law and military necessity, resolved every night by commanding officers who have 90 seconds and no good options. That is where we are. That is what this was. And the question Washington still hasn't answered, the question every admiral in Bahrain is asking, is not whether Marsh was right to fire. The question is what happens the next time, when the ship doesn't go dead in the water.